Good evening. Hi. And welcome to the Washington Ethical Society. My name is Maceo Thomas, and I'm the Building and Outreach Manager. We extend a warm welcome to you who have joined us for the very first time here, and welcome back those who know us well. I'd like to share this West Statement of Purpose. The Washington Ethical Society is a humanistic congregation that affirms the worth of every person. We strive through our relationships to elicit the best in the human spirit. With faith in human goodness, we appreciate each person's unique capacities. We joyfully celebrate together and support each other through life. We nurture a sense of reverence and responsibility for each other and the earth. We warmly invite you to join our community of children and adults as we work for a world where love and justice cross all borders. To learn more about WES, please visit ethicalsociety.org or stop me after the program or any of the members who might be here present. Are there any members present today? Okay. We would like to thank our partners in this evening's talk, the American Humanists Association, Mahogany Books, our financial donors, our amazing volunteer West Tech team, thank you, and all of you who have joined us in person and online. I would like to now share the mic with Emily Newman, who is one of our amazing West members and a staff member at the American Humanist Association.
Yeah, that's okay. All right. I warned the tech team we were going to be doing some height differences, but they're ready. Thank you all for joining us in person and online. I am Emily Newman, she, her, and I actually was just moving to Washington, D.C. and starting to get into the Washington Ethical Society the last time that Anthony Pinn came to speak to us about one of his many other books, When Colorblindness Isn't the Answer. And so we are excited to have him back and excited to continue to share his writing. To let you know a little bit more, so Dr. Anthony Pinn is Agnes Cullen Arnold Distinguished Professor of Humanities at Rice University, where he directs the Center for African and African American Studies, as well as the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. He's also the Director of Research for the Institute for Humanist Studies and a former Dean of the Humanist Studies Program, which is managed by the American Humanist Association. So today, the day between Juneteenth and World Humanist Day, we celebrate his latest, The Black Practice of Disbelief, an introduction to the principles, history, and communities of Black nonbelievers, which is on sale now, and you can get it online or physically in our hallway. And I'd love for us to all welcome Anthony Pinn.
Good evening. Good evening. I thought I was leaving this sort of weather when I got on the plane, but and I forgot my hanky, so I borrowed a washcloth from the hotel. Don't tell them. I'm going to return it. I'm delighted to be with you. As is the case for most of us writing on humanism, this isn't objective, it's subjective. We are connected to and deeply committed to and represented in and by this tradition. It matters to us. So everything I've written on humanism is based upon questions and concerns that impact and inform me. In this text and everything I have written on humanism, I'm here. It's personal. And it's personal because both my personal life and my academic life for better than 30 years now has revolved around an effort to bring together this orientation that matters to me, that's my orientation, Black humanism, together with what I understand about the nature and meaning of the religious. Now, for a lot of folks, this doesn't make sense. Why in the world would you talk about Black humanism and try to connect it to a religious orientation? Doesn't that defeat the purpose? After our time together, I'm hoping that you see where I'm trying to go with this. Now, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. My father's side of the family, not particularly religious. My mother's side, deeply religious, deeply theistic, deeply theistic. So my early years were spent going with my grandfather, who was a deacon at a Baptist church, going with him for Sunday service and behaving in a way that did not bring shame to the family. So sit still, no running around, be cool, because what you did not want was Deacon Ashley Hargrave giving you that look. He didn't have to say a word. He just looked, and you knew you were going to hear about it in the car, and that was bad enough. But you were going to hear about it once you got home. I wanted to avoid that. So I tried to be as cool as a little kid could be, just kind of monitor things, stay put, be respectful, not shame my family. It reached a point where my mother was no longer content with us being at that church, that she was tired of trying to explain away some of the forms of disregard that were deeply embedded in the theological and doctrinal understanding of these Baptist folks. And so for her, it was time out. Enough time had been spent trying to explain away the disregard. She did not want her children to remain in an environment, for example, where women's abilities to be involved were premised not upon talent and skill, but gender. This was not going to work for my mother. She took us out of that church, and we started attending a small, non-denominational church about 5 minutes from my house and on the east side of Buffalo, New York, between Delaware Park, where the zoo was and where there was money, and Humboldt Park, where there wasn't money, near Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Enough said? All right. Small church. It had been started by a couple of families who were not happy with what was taking place within their African Methodist Episcopal church. So they decided they were going to do their own thing, establish their own thing. This church was so small that the pastor in charge was also my Sunday school teacher. And I'm a little kid, right? But he was our Sunday school teacher. And it was often the case that he wouldn't use the Sunday school materials because the scenarios that impacted Jack and Jane weren't our scenarios. The Sunday school lessons outlined experiences and troubles that were not ours. Jack and Jane didn't encounter gang activity. They could walk anywhere. Were not our scenarios. And so from time to time, the minister would leave that Sunday school material alone and just talk with us. And one particular Sunday, he had us in his office, had us sitting in a circle, and he just asked, so what do you want to be when you grow up? Right, getting us to think beyond the present, to think ourselves into a robust future, an exercise of imagination that was supposed to spark something in us and give us a sense of oomph. Went around and there were the usual things. I'm going to be a lawyer, doctor, president. He got to me and I said, preacher. I don't know why I said preacher, but I did. Perhaps it had something to do with the social standing of the minister, the way the minister occupied time and space, the way the minister captured the imagination of folks. Perhaps there was something about how the minister captured time and space that appealed to me. I wanted to have that kind of presence. I said minister, and he said, okay, we start next week. So childhood was over. You know, my grandfather wasn't at this church, so I could do my thing. At this church, I could take a little nap, you know, because Sunday services lasted a long time. I'd take a little nap, get a little piece of hard candy, and I had a favorite game I would play. It involved thinking a number, opening up the hymnal, eyes closed, of course, opening up the hymnal and landing on a page and trying to get that number I thought to match the number that came up. And if I did that, then I could ask to go to the restroom and just wander the church for a minute until my absence was recognized. And then I'd have to take another nap because that game was mentally draining. But all of that was done. I was no longer in the pew, I was in the pulpit. I'm a kid. I couldn't stay out past the street lights. Couldn't go to the corner store alone with my nickel to get my little bag of candy. Couldn't do that alone, but I'm lining the hymns, I'm leading the prayers, I'm opening the doors of the church. And if you know anything about Black church tradition, opening the doors of the church is a big deal. That is the point at which you are inviting folks to give themselves to Christ, yeah? Save their souls and become part of this community. This was a big deal, and this is what I was doing. So I went through the process, and with time, I was ordained. I'm going off to college, and I'm a deacon in this church. And this church had transitioned from being independent to being a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, oldest Black denomination in the country. I was a minister. I could marry, bury, baptize. I went off to New York City, and I'm working at a church in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And this was Bedford-Stuyvesant early 80s. So the crack cocaine presence was intensifying. It was intensifying. And so we were encountering death in real time. And this plagued me. I didn't have a way of processing this. I had spent the last 3 years of high school at a small Southern Baptist independent school. It was a feeder program for Bob Jones University and Liberty Baptist, enough said. And critical thinking was not valued. It was, how does your activity line up with a rather traditional and suffocating read of Scripture? So I get to Columbia, and they're asking me to think critically, and that had been taken from me. I wasn't clear on how to do this because I had been taught you view this through the Bible, and I'm encountering folks in the classroom, faculty members who see the Bible as just a piece of literature. This was just mind-blowing, disorienting. During first-year orientation, after we had gone through the look to your right and look to your left, you know, one of you won't be here next year, right? Once we had gotten past that, they started talking about our environment. And that conversation was cautionary. They were telling folks who looked like me, don't go into Harlem, it's dangerous. So this is disorienting, right? I can't be around the people who look like me, but the folks who don't look like me on this campus are constantly telling me I don't belong here. If I had $1 for each time a white student asked me to produce my SAT scores, I'd have been in good shape. So I'm spending the week on this campus trying to make my way, trying to learn how to think critically, trying to develop those skills. And then weekend, I'm in Bed-Stuy, trying to make sense of a world that made no sense to me. One of the things I did as a minister in that church, I was one of the youth ministers, is I was in charge of an after-school program. And my thing was, okay, if we can just practice writing, right? If we can craft narrative, if we can manipulate words, then we can craft different worlds. So I tell the kids, okay, this is what I want you to do. 15 minutes, you just write, right? Whatever you want to write. It's cool. Whatever you want to write, 15 minutes. And I'm thinking, okay, you're right about the new sneakers you want, or the permanent crease leads that you want to get, the Pumas with the fat laces that you want to get, the Dookie chain that you want to get. That I'm thinking, this is what the number of kids who found it easier to draft a eulogy than to think about future was just mind-blowing. And theologically, I had nothing to offer that made any difference. So I found it increasingly difficult to be there. Right? I'm trying to work through this, so my sense of theology is radically changing. That person who becomes my dude at this point is Adam Clayton Powell Jr., because he saw religion, he saw theism as an occasion to do something different, right? That for him, this theism was effective to the extent it changed life options for folks in Harlem. I could get with this. My theology was changing, and I was still finding it difficult to be there. So I'd figure out ways not to be present on Sunday. Now, the minister in charge of this church was my father in ministry. He had been my pastor in Buffalo. As I was going off to college, he was promoted to a much larger church, this church in Bed-Stuy. So I couldn't just tell him, look, I'm having issues with this. And because the folks needed Reverend Pinn to have answers, not questions. Life was hella hard. They didn't need more questions on Sunday. They needed answers, and I didn't have them. So I'd do things like, I was supposed to be there for the early service, and that really wasn't a problem. Being sleep deprived was a badge of honor, right? So that wasn't the issue. It was not having anything to say that made any sense. So some Sundays I'd go and let that one train pass, and I'd look, okay, let another train pass, look, okay, maybe a third, then I'd get on. And I'd transfer to the A train, but before I'd get on the A train, I'd let a few pass. So by the time I got to Bed-Stuy and was about to walk to the church, I would have been so late that I wouldn't have to be in the pulpit. And I could tell the pastor in charge, Doc, that train. And that was cool. Nothing else needed to be said. I was still interested in ministry, still interested in church, but I had to think about this differently, and I had more questions than I had answers, so I had to get out of New York. I decided to go to a school where ministry really didn't matter. It was the life of the mind, so I packed up and moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm in the Master of Divinity program, the professional degree for ministry, and I'm in that program for two reasons. One, I'm still thinking ministry, but secondly, it allowed a third year of study. I was going to do a PhD. Why? Because my oldest sister was getting one. There was nothing she was going to do that I couldn't do. Right? That's just not how I rolled. If she was getting one, I was going to get one. But that extra year of training gave me additional time to kind of figure some stuff out, get to know faculty members, and put together an application. But I had to work at a church. This was a requirement, field education for that Master of Divinity degree. So I worked at a church in Roxbury, and this church was across the street from a park. And don't think that this was a park where little kids played. This was a park where drug deals took place and prostitution was arranged. And I asked the minister in charge, what we gonna do? I said, Doc, what we gonna do? His response was, let the people get happy with you. That is, hoop and holler on Sunday so they forget. And this wasn't making sense to me. I was moving further and further away. I could not massage my theology anymore. I had to make a decision. Was I going to be about preserving a tradition that I no longer held as true, or was I going to be out? And I was willing to be a lot of things, but I was not going to be a hypocrite. I was not going to stand in the pulpit preaching something I did not believe. So I told the minister in charge I was done. I wouldn't be coming back. I contacted my bishop and said I was surrendering ordination. I wasn't involved anymore. I knew what I wasn't at that point. I wasn't a theist anymore, but I wasn't quite certain what I was. It took a little time to figure this out. I had to find my ancestors, and in part, I found my ancestors by connecting with William R. Jones. Tremendous scholar, wrote a book in 1973, Is God a White Racist? It just blew folks' minds, right? So in dealing with him and thinking with him, I realized I'm a humanist. I'm a humanist. I I entered and completed the PhD with a commitment that I was going to try to do this and work in a way that safeguarded and celebrated segments of the Black population that were non-theistic. But first, I had to cast the net to kind of figure out where these folks were and how this had developed within the context of Black communities. Because within the study of religion where I lodged myself, it was understood, this was the common narrative, Black folks are Christian. Okay, some are Muslim and some practice African-based traditions, but ultimately Black folks are Christian. So I had to rethink that narrative. And it did not take long before I realized, no, that we have made use of a hermeneutic, an interpretive tool in our work that assumes Christianity. And you find what you're looking for. We were looking for Black Christians, so we found Black Christians. And many of my colleagues said, okay, we'll start with the spirituals, right? This first form of musical production. This is all about belief in God, but they did not properly acknowledge the blues. Now, don't think 1920 race records. This is an older musical form, as old as the spirituals. So what we come to call the blues develops as enslaved Africans are trying to make sense of an absurd world. But whereas the spirituals tried to do this in a way that was vertical, understand their significance, their importance in relationship to the divine, something that's up there, out there, the blues talked in terms of horizontal relationships, the value, the beauty of our embodiment, the way in which these bodies give and receive pleasure, the ways in which these bodies are defiant because they celebrate their occupation of time and space. If you look, you also encounter Black voices that are speaking an alternate truth. There was a minister, Alexander Crummell, who was arguing that enslavement was a problem because it perverted the ability of Africans to appreciate theism. It hampered the ability of Black folks to be Christian. And he says he has proof of this, that wherever he went, it was his practice when he met Black folks to ask them, how you doing? What church do you go to? And he encountered a young Black man and asked him, what church do you go to? And the young man told him, white folks are Christian. We can't be. And Crummell argues that this denial of divinity, this denial of theism is a problem. For me, it's to be celebrated, that here is an alternate perspective, a way of viewing the world that is not premised upon magical thinking, but embodied and material realities. It wouldn't be until the late 1800s, 1900s, that Black folks would begin to form humanism in ways that gather public attention. Think in terms of the Harlem Renaissance. Think in terms of Black realism. Think in terms of someone like Richard Wright. Richard Wright in Black Boy argues, look, he tried to do this theistic thing. His grandmother was a theist, so he tried to do this. He went to church, but he says in Black Boy that what really caught his imagination was the music and the minister's wife. The music and the minister's wife, not the theology. And he argues that he gave this a try, but he couldn't get with it. And he argues that if he had encountered the teachings of theism prior to encountering the harshness of the world, it might have made a difference. But having encountered the harshness of the world, the theological platform of the church made no sense to him. James Baldwin, folks get preoccupied and fixated on the early Baldwin, the young man who was a Pentecostal minister, but he leaves the church. And he argues, Baldwin argues, as he's reflecting on a meeting he's going to have with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that he's a little tense about this meeting, not simply because of the Nation of Islam's perspective on sexuality, but because he knows the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is going to ask him about his religious commitments. And in reflecting on this, Baldwin says that his religion was writing. Huey Newton of the Black Panthers has a rather pragmatic, functionalist understanding of theism, that the church is valued to the extent it provides space and resource that can be used for the liberation of Black people. But for him, God is a symbol of human ignorance. And the more we learn about our world, the less we are concerned with doctrine of God. As our knowledge increases, our reliance on the divine decreases. Black humanism continues to advance, and in the 21st century, you have not simply individual Black humanists doing their thing or Black humanists involved in predominantly white organizations, but you have Black humanists developing their own organizations. Organizations in which social justice issues aren't to be debated, they're to be engaged. Organizations in which there is an underlying assumption that this humanism has to promote, it has to urge activity in the world that makes a difference, and that this has to extend beyond science education and separation of church and state. It's got to be about the dismantling of disregard, anti-Black racism, etc. And I can get with all this, I celebrate all this, but it seems to me that there are dimensions of Black humanism we fail to fully appreciate when we try to simply understand it through a grammar and vocabulary of science. That there is something about Black humanism that isn't simply captured through that sort of language. There are elements of this that have to do with affective, psychological, emotional concerns that require a different type of vocabulary and grammar. For me, religion provides this sort of vocabulary and grammar. Now, I'm not the first to suggest this. William Iron Jones says this in 1973. Once the Black humanist acknowledges his debt to the Black church, honors its past labors in the cause of Black freedom, but respectfully declines to further its theistic claims, he must address the charge that his position is alien to the Black religious perspective. Behind that charge, that Black humanism is alien to Black religion, lies an insidious equation that must be exposed for critical examination: the equation of Black religion and Black theism. I understand much of my work to be an effort to complete Dr. Jones's project. And so I begin with this distinction. I think this is an important distinction: religion and theism. I would argue that all forms of theism are religious, but not all religious orientations are theistic. From my vantage point, we have given up too much good stuff to theists. Theists have said, we are religious, and we've said, okay, you can have that term. And as a consequence, there are elements of wonder and awe that we are inadequately naming and describing, because we have surrendered a grammar and vocabulary of wonder and awe because theists said religion is theirs. As if the only way to define religion involves belief in God or gods. This just isn't the case. Marx says that religion is the opiate of the people. Freud says that religion is a collective neurosis. Carl Jung argues that it is the symbolic presentation of life meaning. The theologian Paul Tillich frames religion in terms of two things: ultimate concern, what is that thing that matters to you most, and ultimate orientation. What does that adherence to the thing that matters most, what does that mean? What does it play out? How does it play out in terms of your movement through the world? Ultimate concern, ultimate orientation. I think about religion this way. It is a quest for complex subjectivity. That is to say that religion is a systematic effort to wrestle with the fundamental questions of human existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? For some folks, that involves elements of the divine or transcendence. For folks like me, it does not. It is simply a way of fostering life meaning. Religion is a meaning-making device. Simply put, a meaning-making device. But it's a device that allows us to explore and appreciate those elements of ourselves that are not fully captured, again, through the vocabulary and grammar of science. It also provides a way of taming scientific grammar and vocabulary by recognizing that science and scientists live within the context of cultural worlds. If this were not the case, we'd have a much more difficult time explaining the Tuskegee experiment. Scientists live within the context of cultural worlds, yeah? Respond to and are tied to the assumptions of those cultural worlds. Again, the Tuskegee experiment. But we need a vocabulary grammar. We need a set of tools that allows us to unpack and explore and explain these cultural worlds, to better understand how they touch us and how we touch them. A vocabulary and grammar that helps us to better understand the affective, the emotional, the psychological dimensions of who we are and what it means for us to be present in this world. But I think that requires, again, making a distinction between theism and religion. I think humanism is opposed to theism, but I'm not quite convinced that humanism of necessity is opposed to religion. I'm hard-pressed to believe that humanists are not concerned with meaning-making, are not concerned with life meaning. But through scientific grammar and vocabulary, it becomes really difficult to understand, to appreciate, and to develop ritual practices. And we tend to assume, well, that's the church people. They do that ritual thing. No, but rituals are repeated activity in founded space. They don't require God or gods. Repeated activity in founded space. So if you go to the American Humanist Association meeting, you are participating in ritual practices. If you come here, you are participating in ritual structures, ritual practices, repeated activity in founded space. But we need a vocabulary, a grammar that allows us to capture that, to massage it, to nurture it. I think that vocabulary, that grammar, is religion. Now, some of this gets toyed with. A dear friend of mine, Candace Gorham, says this: I've grown to like non-theist as a broad spectrum term that carries less baggage than more commonly used words such as atheist or agnostic. And because discussions about death are often virtually inseparable from the discussions about the spiritual, I intentionally wanted to use a term with direct spiritual implications, unlike terms such as secular or free thinker, which more generally speak to social and civic issues. Now, she says this in relationship to a book she had written on death and dying and how Black humanists might wrestle with issues of death and dying, but it's a stretching of vocabulary and grammar. She's making spiritual do a different type of work. And it seems to me in making this vocabulary and grammar, do a different type of work, we open ourselves up to a very different way of engaging. And so I want to conclude with this, that from my vantage point then, if we think about Black humanism as a religious orientation, a non-theistic religious orientation, some might even say a secular religious orientation, it is premised upon a set of principles, or what some might call belief. From my vantage point, these boil down to at least 6 principles. First, suspicion or denial of the existence of God or gods. It's just us. Just us. There's human accountability and responsibility. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There is too much certainty in that because it's a statement that assumes that there is a divine presence that is consistent when we are inconsistent, that is active when we are inactive. Black humanists might say the arc of the moral universe is long. Mic drop, that's it. Human accountability and responsibility. There are no forces out there laboring on our behalf. If we make a difference in this world, it is premised upon our activity, our sustained activity. And so from my vantage point, rather than traditional conversations concerning hope that assume outcome-driven strategies and a divine presence, Black humanists might be more comfortable with the persistence of possibility. It's not as certain. I understand why my theistic friends are, someday we will overcome someday, because they don't understand themselves to be laboring alone. Where we screw up, God is consistent. For them, this is played out in the biblical text. It's played out in the activities that mark human history. Think in terms of the civil rights movement, for example. As a non-theistic humanist, I don't have those certainties. I don't know that any of this ultimately works out. And so activity in the world is not premised upon outcome-driven strategies. We don't do A because we know it will get us to B. We do A because it is our last best effort. It's what we can do. And at the end of the day, this human accountability and responsibility might not radically change circumstances, but it will make it much more difficult to normalize the misery of the marginalized. At the end of the day, what we may end up with, this may be our best outcome, is the ability to say no to injustice with sustained energy and increased volume. And again, the win may simply be making it much more difficult to normalize injustice, to simply say, well, this is the way it is. What we have is history. Our activities take place within the parameters, the boundaries of human history, and it's all embodied. There's a materiality, there's a substance to us, and this is the way in which we mark our movement. Nothing transcendent, nothing non-material, just the material conditions, the material possibilities of life. We do this work within the context of community and within the context of world. And this might involve an appreciation of the ancestors to the degree folks remain alive, to the extent we remember them. And our moral and ethical reach, our moral and ethical commitments as Black humanists might be premised upon the work of our ancestors and what our ancestors require. Those who remain alive to the extent we remember them. And this all takes place within the context of this world. There is no special knowledge, no gnosis that is available to the select few. That's not how this works. No, the Bible says that what we understand and how we move through the world is based upon reason and logic and a sound understanding of culture and how culture develops and how it moves. Based upon all of this, there's a need for persistent activity, that we have the capacity for improvement. Perhaps not victory, but improvement. And within the context of these principles practiced and ritualized within the context of community, there is reason to be optimistic, to understand the capacity of humanism to make a difference in the world, whether or not it ultimately wins the day. But again, and I'll end with this, so much of this gets lost. These inner workings, the nuance of Black humanism gets lost if we don't have a vocabulary and grammar that's able to capture some of these dimensions of life, that is able to appreciate and move within the context of cultural forms. Thanks so much. Yeah.
So, thank you so much. Lots to think about, and reminder, he continues to give us more information on history, the present, the future. So I'll keep an eye on the questions coming in online, and folks in the room, you can raise your hand and we'll have a handheld mic come to you. I do remind folks, as always, to aim to be brief. We do want to make sure to respect everyone's time today, and we're going to use this privilege of having time with Dr. Pinn to get to ask questions and get more insight. We are saving all of the chat and the questions, so we can always do follow-up with that later on. And the folks in the room have the advantage of being able to also stick around for the reception and hang out and talk to each other. We've got one of our very active animal lovers who always reminds us about sentientism and wants to kind of bring that aspect in. As humans, we can make ethical choices, whereas most animals cannot. Why are we only concerned about our relationships with other humans?
I appreciate that, but I also want to be mindful of the fact, and I think Cornel West is right on this, that it's only recently that the idea of that Black people are human has been appreciated, right? So I want some time to kind of wrestle with the nature and meaning of Black humanity before I jettison it, right? And again, it's only in recent years that the idea of Black people as human has been valid, part of the cultural ethos of the United States. So it's not that I'm not concerned with other life forms, but I'm still wrapping my mind around what it means to understand Black people as human within a context that is decidedly anti-Black.
I'm going to pause. Thank you. Seems like they're not getting the sound online. Oh, it's not me? Okay. Okay.
Let me ask this.
How about you? Go ahead. Should we bring that handheld one up? Yes, did you try again?
Test.
Yeah.
Test, test. Okay. Do we need to go back to Emily's question? I guess Dr. Pinn answered that. So this was very personal to me. First, Emily, I want to thank you for inviting me to be up here because that's probably the only reason I read the book. I'm going to be honest, like me getting through books has been difficult. This was very easy for me to get through. As I was reading it, I was telling people about this, and I said, wow, I wish I had read this 30 years ago. I know you just wrote this one. But even as you mentioned, the very first sentence of the book, according to popular imagination in the United States, to be a Black American is to be a Black Christian. Well, I actually thought it was a Black Baptist, but that tells you where my people come from. So I come from church people. I work here, and me coming here was an exploration of something different. I'm in a cousin chat, and I've invited people to things like this, and I have a cousin who is upset that she's not going to see me in heaven. And I told her that's okay because it doesn't exist, and hell probably doesn't exist either. But what my question is when I think about church and Christianity, I think about this respectability in Blackness as part of your upward mobility. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, respectability politics. Major thread of thought within Black church understanding, in part because Black churches assumed if Black people presented themselves in ways that white folks were comfortable with, the attitude of white folks towards Blacks would change. Yeah? So dress the right way, speak properly, be morally and ethically upstanding, and white folks will have no choice but to rethink how they understand us. Yeah, but what that also involved was a implicit acceptance of some of the other forms of social disregard. So Black church said this, but in the next breath told Black women, no, what you get to do here is no. Right? So the oldest Black denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it's not until the 20th century that a Black woman is ordained and that ordination stands. But this denomination was all about respectability politics. If we behave in a way that is upstanding, that is non-threatening, white folks will treat us differently. But at the same time, telling Black women you are less than. Forget about the church's inability to deal with issues of gender and sexuality. Yeah? So it was a focus on anti-Black racism as culturally and socially driven without any attention to the other markers of disregard. Those were embraced. Get Black together first.
So for folks who are not familiar with Washington Ethical Society, we here are both affiliated with the Unitarian Universalist Association as well as the American Ethical Union. So we have had our share of secularizing some very religious material and themes to make it more accessible to our wide set of beliefs. And we do have a question online about where is a good place or recommended resources you have to go to form this new vocabulary of secular life and to kind of get comfortable or creative about the terminology?
I would suggest one good place to start is Alice Walker's nonfiction. That within her nonfiction, I have in mind, for example, Living by the Word. Within the context of that text, you have a different way of understanding how we touch the world and are touched by the world that appreciates awe and wonder and gives us ways to name and respond to that. So I would start with Alice Walker, and then I'd move to Zora Neale Hurston, then James Baldwin. Lorraine Hansberry, A Raisin in the Sun, provides both critique and insight, right? And one of the things that's so valuable about A Raisin in the Sun is the way in which it encourages us to rethink space, right? Place, from my vantage point, place is the intentional manipulation of time and space to give that a different sensibility. Think about A Raisin in the Sun. Where do these hardcore conversations about meaning in place, about our subjectivity, where do they take place? In the living room, right? This is a way of rethinking space. And from my mind, that rethinking of space, renaming space is part of the process, right? So beyond that, when I had hair, the barbershop was important. But the barbershop was never just about getting your hair cut. If the barbershop had been just about getting a haircut, I wouldn't have been there 3 and 4 hours. Right? But there was something about the barbershop that also helped us wrestle with these substantive issues of life, that provided an opportunity to think, to explore fundamental questions of our existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? Right? So again, I think looking at Lorraine Hansberry sensitizes us to space, how we name it, how we utilize it.
Of that, okay, a little switch. Building on that concept of space, as you said, there is still the fundamental concept often talked about in humanism of separating church and state, so religion and government. And yet you're discussing this concept of like not letting go of religion, but using connecting it to humanism. And so how do you then make sure that we don't end up getting into some of the challenges or of the power issues that religion has in terms of like trying to show up into schools or trying to show up into politics, making sure that the meaning making and the values are there without getting into the murky trying to connect it all together.
And for me, this is one of the places where it's really important to be mindful of this distinction between religion and theism. That religion is simply a process of making life meaningful. We do this within the context of our individual lives and the individual within the context of community, right? This is where it takes place, but it doesn't privilege any particular text. It doesn't argue that there's only one way to be moral and ethical in the world, right? It doesn't argue that we ought to not talk about in our high school textbooks climate change and DEI and slavery, right? It's simply about the process of making life meaningful. So I would make that distinction between religion and theism in that regard.
So as I got towards the end of the book, you mentioned Frederick Douglass as a humanist, and you had a quote, and I think about how everything I read about, or and I'm not necessarily a historian, I never hear anybody say Frederick Douglass as a humanist or a non-theist, yet we always hear about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, a Southern Baptist preacher. How are we moving forward now to like recognize even more of these non-theist Black people in our history, as well as more in our history than what's happening today?
Yeah. I think this requires Black non-theists being committed to exploring their history. But for too long, it seems to me, Black non-theists have let Black theists craft the narrative. So all of these folks become theists. Even W.E.B. Du Bois becomes a churchman. Why? Because he wrote about the Black church. I've written about the Black church, but they're not going to say, I'm a theist. Right? Or James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson writes God Trombones, but he argues as an undergraduate, he left all that theism behind, right? So what you get with someone like a W.E.B. Du Bois or Frederick Douglass, you get an understanding of theism's cultural impact, right? No regard for its theological impact, it's a cultural form. So James Weldon Johnson can say there is something magisterial, something awe-inspiring about the Black sermonic style, this style of presentation, this rhythmic style of presentation, this call and response, without assuming that the theology expressed through that sermonic style is worth adherence.
I'd like to check in with folks in the room. If there's, yeah, thank you.
First of all, Dr. Pinn, thank you for being with us and sharing, and thank you all, even the people behind me involved. My name is David. So I'd like to take the last series of questions and say they're goodly challenges. Is it a fool's errand to try to have some agenda, I won't question motive, to disaggregate these contrasts of too much scientism to understand Black humanism, too much romanticism or religiosity to understand? I wouldn't foolishly play the game of pick one or pick the other, but there are differences with even the people you named. Douglas would be more in the fold of a theistic humanism, probably because I'm ill-informed, but on the other hand, there were other examples you named that were kind of definitive. The reason for asking about disaggregation is not to find the ultimate truth, but to really, truly, deeply understand and appreciate them, the meanings behind the activities and the work of these people. Thank you.
For me, more important than what we find is how we look. And so I would encourage a particular interpretive tool, that there is a tremendous amount of value in doubt as an interpretive tool. So reading through US history, reading through Black history, looking for doubt becomes a way of identifying different conversation partners and different conversations. And this element of doubt is rich in a Douglas. It's rich in Du Bois. Let's not forget that Du Bois says before leaving for Ghana, he writes to a friend and he says, chin up, fight on, knowing the Negro can't win. Chin up, fight on, knowing the Negro can't win. Right? So there's a sense of doubt as productive for Du Bois, in part because he's moving away from outcome-driven strategies. You don't press forward. You don't do simply because you think you're going to win. You push forward, you do because you can. So again, rather than looking for outcomes, right? Rather than looking for particular narratives, I would encourage a different hermeneutic, a different interpretive tool, the interpretive value of doubt, and how that plays out in narratives of Black advancement.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm not sure I know how to phrase this question in a really appropriate way, but I'll just shoot it out and you can shoot me down if it's wrong. How would you characterize the journey of white Americans into humanism different from Black Americans into humanism? Are there characteristic differences? Is there a fundamental difference? There's probably more, and you're going yes.
So I'll limit myself to one distinction, right? For me, this distinction is significant, that Black humanists and white humanists tend to have a very different relationship to the Enlightenment. That white humanists tend to approach the Enlightenment in a way that is uncritical, a celebration of reason and logic and the assumption of human progress. Black humanists understand that they were part of the Enlightenment experiment. Yeah, that the Enlightenment involves the further development, perhaps the perfection of a philosophy of anti-Blackness. Think about how David Hume understood people of African descent. Yeah, think about how Kant understood people of African descent. And so that difference in terms of the relationship to the Enlightenment informs and influences not simply how humanism is thought within these two communities, but how it is practiced. I would argue that within the context of humanist circles, it's a relatively recent development, this understanding that social justice issues are core for us, are of fundamental importance. This is relatively recent. I would argue it has always been part of the thinking for Black humanists of necessity. But white humanists could argue, whoa, no, reason and logic, right? Race isn't real, so why are we even talking about it? Or throwing the rock and hiding the hand. All of this is the problem of the religious. If we didn't have religions, if we didn't have theism, we wouldn't have any of these issues. Again, forgetting that some sure enough secular folks in the Enlightenment did not appreciate people who look like me. So I would argue again that there's a fundamental difference with respect to posture towards the Enlightenment.
Thank you so much for your talk. I sit on the board of one of those two organizations that Emily mentioned, the American Ethical Union. Last week, I was at a conference about organizational development, and I had an opportunity to talk with someone who works in diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. And we were having a conversation, and I decided to take advantage of the opportunity to ask her. I said, I am a religious humanist, and I'm on the board of this organization. Can you offer general suggestions on how our organization moves in the right direction? Her answer was, abandon humanism. Humanism is so tainted. I think she was referring to what you referred to, and I think I understand her answer better now. I think her argument was that humanism is so tainted by its history, and she referred me, and I can't recall his name, referred me to one of these very strong, powerful, recent, I don't think it was William Barber. It was someone before, maybe a generation before, who had spoken about it. So she was steering me towards evocative, theistic ministers for inspiration. I was wondering if you could comment.
Well, I wouldn't suggest abandoning humanism, but I would suggest recognizing that humanism is flawed, right? And that we need a very different strategy. We've been fixated on decreasing the harm that theists do in the world, forgetting about the harm that we do, right? We need a different strategy. And that strategy, from my mind, needs to involve this: a commitment to decreasing the harm that theists do in the world, and a commitment to decreasing the harm that humanists do in the world. But we've been too self-assured that the problem's those theists, not us. That's just a lie, right? That is a straight up lie. That we are involved in, celebrate, and practice a flawed philosophy of life. And it becomes our responsibility to decipher how it's flawed and work to address those flaws.
Can you help me understand, is there a default for an atheist to be a humanist? Is like, if I just consider myself to be an atheist, do I default to humanist? Or is there some other thing that, I guess, I have to, something at the essence of being a humanist?
Yeah, I like that question. I would think about it this way: that atheism expresses a certain relationship to theism, a rejection of theism, a disbelief in God. but it really doesn't say much concerning what your moral and ethical commitments are. Tells me what, right? It kind of defines things by negation. You don't believe this, but it doesn't tell me what you do believe, right? What your moral and ethical commitments are, what's your moral compass. And for me, that's where humanism comes in. It doesn't simply privilege the negation. We don't believe in God. It says something about the orientation, the commitments, right? The moral and ethical sensibilities. It says something that's not simply negative, but also positive. Here's the dilemma. Within the context of the United States, folks are more likely to understand what you mean when you say you're an atheist than when you say you're a humanist. In my experience, lots of folks say humanism, and what they mean is humanitarianism. Right? So I think humanists have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting to better express and explain what we mean, what these commitments entail. But again, I would argue that atheism tells me what you don't hold to, but doesn't tell me a whole lot concerning what you do value, what you do engage.
Abby will go the last one in person, and then we'll go online.
Hi, Abby Dakin. I'm a member here as well. Great to have you in the hall again.
Be here.
That last point is why, despite its difficulties, I tend to use the word humanist instead of non-theist. But my actual question, though, is in response to the previous question, one thing I think about a lot is humility. And the history of public atheist intellectuals in the US does not involve a lot of humility, nor did the Enlightenment, for that matter, involve a great deal of humility. And one of the things that I think we can learn, despite the fact that humility should be natural to a religion or a practice of questions instead of answers. Whereas a lot, not all, but many religious communities have a certain humility in their practitioners. Anyway, I am wondering how you see how we can bring more humility into the practice of humanism in the US.
Again, I would argue it requires recognizing that our philosophy of life is flawed, that we do significant harm in the world. And for me, this is a marker of humility, a recognition that we've got some growing to do, some shifting and changing to undertake. Rather than assuming we are committed to reason and logic, we're good, the problem is elsewhere. That just doesn't work. One other thing in terms of these categories, I think when it comes to issues of gender, class, sexuality, et cetera, we understand that we occupy more than one social space simultaneously. Yeah? So it seems to me, with respect to our relationship to non-theism or theism, we ought to be able to appreciate that we occupy more than one space simultaneously. So depending on the context, I will say I'm an atheist. Depending on the context, it might be more useful for me to say I'm a secular humanist, right? I occupy more than one social space simultaneously. And so the way in which I name myself and present myself needs to reflect that ability to occupy more than one space. More than one thing can be true.
I'd say similarly, depending on the circumstance, when I define humanism, I may bump one of those principles you mentioned to the top. This is the first thing I need you to know, and then the other things. And I want to highlight. In the book, there's a chapter on social justice where you do some great comparisons between the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Movement, showing how there's definitely overlap, but they had different drives and focuses, which I won't spoil, but definitely So we'll take, so one more from online, actually from one of our humanist chaplains, says, you mentioned the difference between scientific and religious languages' ability to discourse about the human condition. What advice do you have about improving our spiritual fluency as humanists?
In terms of my own thinking and works, spiritual isn't really a term that I make use of. And so I would think about that a bit differently. And so I would agree with Candace Gorman that what we're getting at are these affective, emotional, psychological dimensions that produce a sense of wonder and awe that aren't adequately explained through the language of science. But I would not use the language of spirituality personally. That language doesn't work for me.
Again, this is personal, right? These are some personal stories for people when they think about themselves as human. I had a great conversation with a friend of mine last week who had a similar story to you. Going to college, she was there every Friday night, and Wednesday was something else, and gospel choir. And I was reminding her of her Facebook post about 4 or 5 years ago. And she posted all of the books that she had, women in the Bible, this is that in the Bible. And she was basically coming out that I don't believe this anymore. You talk about in the book how the church, the Black church, has been such an institution in our community that it covered so much that you had people who basically had to swallow or tolerate. And there was probably some psychological damage that was happening. What would you say to the brothers and sisters who are maybe not able to get to a Wes or something else, and how they can have hope to find a community or not be isolated by coming out to some of their family members or their church members that they don't any longer believe?
Yeah. First, I just want to say something else in terms of that last question. I would suggest reading Sasha Sagan's book. I mean, she's brilliant, and it feels to me as if she's wrestling with these sorts of issues in a way that would make sense to the person posing that question. And in terms of the question concerning community, I think it's easier now than it was 20 years ago. That so many of these communities, like Black non-believers, have an online presence, right? There are chapters, but there's an online presence. Sikivu Hutchinson in LA, there are physical activities, but there's also online presence. And I think one of the things that's really of value in the kind of work that Dr. Hutchinson is doing and Mandisa Thomas is doing, they understand the necessity of a soft place to land. That part of the problem with the larger humanist movement has been that so much of the time and attention goes to a critique of theism. Well, hell, Black folks leaving the church, they already understand the problem with theism. That's why they're leaving. Now, what else? Right? But at these meetings, there's a critique of theism, a patting on the back, a cup of coffee, people go home. But what about the folks who understand that this is a problem, but there's a whole lot at stake for them, right? They are already saddled with signs of disregard, race, gender, class. Add another? Without a soft place to land, folks who are not simply about the business of critiquing the Black church, but are providing them with community, ritual practices, an alternate family. But again, they're easier to find because they all have an online presence now.
Sorry, just checking more. We, of course, could go on, but in respect of everyone's time, I would love to thank the Washington Ethical Society for providing us with this space, and their volunteers. Of course, so ethicalsociety.org, of course, always welcome for you to check out American Humanist Association at americanhumanist.org. For our book lovers, Mahogany Books is mahoganybooks.com. And again, they're selling in the hallway. And Dr. Pinn, I'd love to give you the chance to final thoughts, calls to action, last word.
Thanks for coming out. If you have questions that we didn't get to address here, I'm easy to find. Just email me, pinn@rice.edu. Don't call me unless you want a response in 3 or 4 months. But if you want a more immediate response, email me.